1532 marks the definitive rupture in the timeline of the South American continent, a moment where the silence of the high Andes was permanently shattered, not just by the thunder of arquebuses or the clash of steel armor against stone weaponry, but by a much more intimate and devastating sound, the fracturing of the domestic sphere. To understand the true history of the Spanish conquest, we must look
past the battlefields of Cajamarca and Cusco and zoom in on the sleeping quarters of the indigenous household, particularly the cancha compounds, where the daily life of the Inca Empire was lived. Imagine the terrified reality for an indigenous woman in the Central Highlands during those initial chaotic months when the protective structures of kinship and community dissolved almost overnight, leaving her vulnerable to a new and brutal status quo, where the arrival of foreign men signaled an immediate and catastrophic loss of bodily autonomy. This narrative is not a dramatic retelling for cinematic effect, but a cold historical reality confirmed by the rigorous application of forensic science and the meticulous translation of dust-covered colonial archives that have survived for centuries in Seville and Lima. We are looking at the systematic dismantling of human dignity, where women were physically dragged from their communities and transformed into the spoils of war. A narrative supported by bioarchaeology and the skeletal record, which shows a sudden and statistically significant spike in perimortem trauma, consistent with violent capture and resistance. If you are truly interested in the untold truth of the Spanish conquest and the fall of the Inca Empire, make sure to follow along closely as we dig deep into the dark history of colonial Peru to unearth voices that have been silenced for 500 years. Excavations at archaeological sites like Huánuco Pampa and the residential sectors of early colonial Cusco reveal that domestic architecture changed abruptly to accommodate new male masters with the hasty erection of new walls and the destruction of traditional, distinct living spaces. Chroniclers such as Pedro Cieza de León, who traveled the Andes in the years immediately following the invasion, documented the mass seizure of women, not as an accidental byproduct of war, but as a standard tactic of psychological and physical warfare intended to break the spirit of the local population.
The immediate fallout was the total collapse of the indigenous social safety net, meaning access to food, shelter, and clothing was no longer guaranteed by the Ailu or extended family network, but was instead dictated by the erratic whims of a foreign conqueror. This seismic shift paved the way for the institutionalization of abuse, known as the encomienda system, a royal grant mechanism recorded in the vast folios of El Archivo General de Indias, dating back to the 1530s, which effectively distributed human beings as currency to Spanish soldiers who had participated in the campaigns. These administrative documents from Lima and Seville list indigenous peoples, specifically women, as tribute obligations, turning human lives into resources to be parceled out by the crown in a bureaucratic transaction that ignored their humanity. The famous defender of indigenous rights, the Dominican friar Bartolomé de las Casas, wrote a scathing and detailed account in 1552, cataloging the moral crimes he witnessed where encomenderos treated women as property for forced sexual access, a claim that, for centuries, was dismissed by some as exaggeration, but which modern science now corroborates with horrifying precision. Skeletal remains found in early colonial cemeteries tell a harrowing story through specific stress markers on the bones, such as cribra orbitalia, which appears as sponge-like pitting in the eye sockets, and enamel hypoplasia, which manifests as horizontal lines on the teeth. These are not random deformities. They are the biological signatures of severe nutritional deficiencies and chronic disease loads that align perfectly with the first decades of colonial extraction and the disruption of traditional food systems. This biological data points to a drastic and measurable decline in female health alongside the imposition of new taxes and labor demands, raising the urgent question of how the Spanish legal system tried and failed to control this chaos. The laws of Burgos, passed earlier in 1512, were the first attempt by the Spanish crown to regulate the treatment of indigenous subjects, theoretically offering protection for women and children against the worst excesses of the abuse. However, letters from royal officials and missionaries preserved in the archives reveal a vast and unbridgeable distance between the written law created in Europe and the gritty, violent reality of the Andean frontier, where local encomenderos frequently ignored royal decrees, with the famous phrase, "I obey, but I do not comply." Archaeological studies of early mission sites near Arequipa and Lake Titicaca show that while the church attempted to concentrate populations for protection and religious conversion, this policy often resulted in further isolation of women from their traditional kin networks, creating a confusing landscape of sanctuary and control, where the protectors often became the abusers. The friction between Spanish canon law, which viewed marriage as a rigid, indissoluble sacrament, and indigenous tradition, which often allowed for trial marriages and polygamy, intensified as the conquest cemented its hold on the region in the late 1530s, causing a rupture in the social fabric that chroniclers like Inca Garcilaso de la Vega and Sarmiento de Gamboa recorded with deep sorrow. These writers noted the appropriation of elite Inca women as concubines for high-ranking Spanish captains, a practice that was political as well as sexual, intended to graft the Spanish lineage onto the prestigious Inca bloodlines. Letters from Francisco Pizarro himself, alongside notarial records from early colonial Cusco, casually list the assignment of women to households as if they were inventory, confirming that this was a top-down strategy of domination and not merely the rogue actions of undisciplined soldiers. When archaeologists dig into the stratigraphic layers of elite Inca palaces, they find tools for weaving and ceramics left exactly where they were dropped, suggesting a hasty and terrified abandonment that coincides with these documented raids and seizures. The bones of high-status women from this period bear the marks of displacement and violence, proving that the symbolic appropriation of the Inca nobility was a physical and brutal process intended to legitimize the new colonial hierarchy by taking the women who embodied the sovereignty of the empire. The Catholic Church quickly inserted itself into this dynamic, attempting to police sexual morality from the 1540s onward, with missionary correspondence from the Dominican and Franciscan orders detailing their tireless efforts to enforce Christian marriage on a population reeling from trauma. Bishop visitations, which were essentially inspection tours, recorded desperate complaints from women forced into cohabitation, while parish registers from the mid-16th century show a sudden rise in baptisms for children of mixed ancestry, often the result of unsanctioned and coercive unions. Burials in churchyards from this era show a disruption in traditional mortuary practices, indicating that the spiritual conquest was just as aggressive as the military one, leaving women to navigate a world where their traditional marriage norms clashed violently with rigid Spanish morality. This collision of cultures is visible in isotopic analyses of remains from Trujillo and Cusco, which reveals a dietary shift for women who had less access to high-quality protein like llama meat and guinea pig after the conquest, reflecting their marginalized status in the new colonial economy. Census records from the 1570s document a demographic collapse and skewed sex ratios in mining districts and textile production zones, confirming that the demand for labor and tribute tore families apart and left women to fend for themselves in a landscape of depopulation. Legal files from the Rio Audiencia, the High Court of the colony, contain heartbreaking petitions from women seeking compensation for abandonment and abuse, proving that while the law was often deaf to their pleas, they never stopped trying to use the Spanish legal system against their oppressors. The Aklas, or chosen women of the Inca religion, were specifically targeted as their institutional protection vanished and they were redistributed into Spanish households for labor and sexual service, a transition documented in ethno-historic sources and confirmed by the repurposing of Aklawasi structures into nunneries or private haciendas. Skeletal analysis from coastal Peru shows a disturbing increase in peri-fractures, which are breaks in the forearm sustained when shielding the face from a blow, and healed blunt force trauma on female remains compared to pre-contact eras, providing forensic evidence that interpersonal violence became a normalized tool of control in colonial households. Notarial records are filled with testimonies of assault by patrons and soldiers, suggesting that coercive power was maintained through the constant threat of physical harm, and that the household was often the most dangerous place for a woman to be. While colonial courts technically offered a path to justice, with archives holding petitions for dowries and maintenance, the system was heavily stacked against indigenous women due to language barriers and a legal culture that prioritized male property rights over female safety. Despite this, the demographic landscape was permanently altered, as shown by the explosion of the mestizo population in baptismal registries, where Spanish fathers often refused to recognize their mixed-race children, leaving mothers to fend for themselves, and creating a generation of children with uncertain social status. The new laws of 1542 were another failed attempt by the Crown to curb the power of the settler class and protect indigenous subjects, but local resistance from the conquistadores was fierce, leading to civil wars that further endangered women. Microhistorical research into the lives of individual women reveals a pattern of resilience, where mothers used the courts to demand support for their children and leveraged their knowledge of the system to survive, often employing court translators to make their voices heard. The Mita labor draft further destabilized the family unit by draining communities of men who were sent to the silver mines of Potosi, leaving women to shoulder the burden of subsistence farming, while simultaneously exposing them to predation by outsiders who saw these female-headed households as easy targets. Epidemic diseases like smallpox and measles acted as a force multiplier for this vulnerability, wiping out community guardians and leaving women and girls exposed to exploitation in a shattered society where the old rules no longer applied. Military culture played a significant role as garrison towns became centers of abuse, where soldiers acted with impunity, a reality reflected in the archaeology of barracks, located uncomfortably close to indigenous settlements, where the spatial arrangement itself facilitated sexual violence. Legal instruments like dowry contracts show that some women were able to negotiate a degree of security within this coercive system, turning the law into a marketplace for survival and securing economic resources for their mixed-race offspring. Missionaries continued to advocate for reform, with figures like Las Casas using the pulpit to condemn the sexual violence that underpinned the colonial economy. But the financial incentives for settlers to exploit indigenous labor were simply too high to overcome with moral arguments alone. Municipal records show that local elites frequently conspired to ignore royal orders that threatened their access to women and labor, creating a corrupt political economy that entrenched these abuses and normalized the exploitation of indigenous women. Yet indigenous communities did not accept this passively, as collective petitions and the reorganization of settlements demonstrate a strategic effort to protect women from outside aggression. By moving homes to more defensible locations or hiding women during the arrival of tax collectors, family structures evolved to meet these challenges, with wills and testaments revealing how kinship networks were reconfigured to secure the future of mixed-race children and safeguard property, ensuring that despite the chaos, some lineage and wealth could be preserved. The emergence of a racialized caste system in the 17th century further codified these inequalities, determining a woman's rights and social standing based on her ancestry and cementing her vulnerability into the legal code of the colony. Literary works like those of the indigenous author Guaban Poma de Aya serve as a powerful critique of this abuse, preserving the memory of injustice alongside the archaeological evidence of segregated cemeteries and stratified burial goods, which show that inequality persisted even in death. Despite centuries of oppression, cultural survival is evident in the continuity of textile traditions and ritual practices maintained by women who acted as the guardians of their heritage, weaving hidden symbols of resistance into the very cloth they produced for their oppressors. The slow demographic recovery of the 18th century brought new challenges, but also new institutions like charitable convents, which offered a fragile safety net for the most vulnerable women, often housing orphans and widows of the colonial system. Today, the combination of bioarchaeology and archival research forces us to confront this painful legacy, not as a footnote, but as a central theme of the colonial experience, demanding that we look at the conquest through the eyes of those who endured it. The repatriation of remains and the creation of memorials are modern attempts to reckon with a history of systematic violation that was written in both law and bone, reminding us that the story of the conquest is incomplete without the testimony of those who survived it. 1532 was not just the end of an era, but the beginning of a long and painful struggle for dignity that continues to resonate in the Andes today. The reed partitions may have been torn down, but the spirit of the women who lived behind them was never fully extinguished.
We see this resilience in the way legal battles were fought, in the way children were raised, and in the way culture was preserved against all odds. When we analyze the isotopes in the teeth of a woman buried in a colonial churchyard in Cusco, we are not just looking at chemical data, we are looking at a biography of survival. We can tell where she was gorned, what she ate before the Spanish arrived, and how her diet deteriorated after the invasion, providing a molecular witness to the history of extraction. The transition from the Inca period to the colonial period was not a smooth handover of power, but a violent collision that took place on the bodies of women. The chronicles tell us of the great battles, but they often whisper the stories of the household, which is why we must listen so closely to the archaeological record. In the dusty archives of the Vatican and the Indies, there are thousands of letters written by priests who were horrified by the behavior of their own countrymen, documenting rapes and kidnappings with the level of detail that is difficult to read. These documents are not just bureaucratic fluff, they are crime scenes preserved in ink. They tell us of the Yanaconas, the servant class that expanded rapidly after the conquest, often comprised of women who had been displaced from their ayllus. The exploitation was not just sexual, it was economic, as women were forced to spin cotton and weave wool for the benefit of their encomenderos, often working until their hands bled to meet impossible quotas. This labor is invisible in many history books, which focus on the silver mines and the male laborers, but the textile tribute was the backbone of the early colonial economy, and it was carried on the backs of women. The breakdown of the Andean dualism, where men and women had complementary roles, was replaced by a European patriarchy that viewed women as legal minors, unable to own property or make decisions without the consent of a male guardian.
This legal infantilization made it incredibly difficult for indigenous women to protect themselves, yet they persisted, filing lawsuits and demanding their rights in a language that was not their own. The figure of the mestiza woman became a central character in the colonial drama, often bridging the two worlds, but belonging fully to neither. Utilized as a cultural broker, but often despised by the rigid racial hierarchy. As we move deeper into the colonial centuries, the violence changed shape, becoming more institutionalized and less chaotic, but no less oppressive. The Inquisition, which set up shop in Lima, began to target indigenous practices that women had kept alive, driving healing rituals and ancestor worship underground. The accusation of witchcraft became a new tool of control, used to punish women who held on to their traditional power or who refused to submit to the new religious order. Archaeological evidence from the 17th century shows the persistence of traditional grave goods hidden within Christian burials, small figurines or offerings of coca leaves tucked into the folds of a shroud, proving that the spiritual conquest was never total. The legacy of this trauma is still being unpacked today by historians and descendant communities who are using the tools of science to reclaim their ancestors' stories. It is a history of immense pain, but also of incredible strength, a testament to the human capacity to endure even when the world is falling apart. The seizure of women was the first act of the conquest, and in many ways it defined the entire colonial project, a project based on the extraction of life and labor from the indigenous body. But the fact that we are telling this story today, the fact that the records exist and the bones are being studied, is a victory of memory over oblivion. We must honor these stories, not just as tragic anecdotes, but as foundational elements of our understanding of the Americas. The partition is open, and we can finally see inside. 1532 serves as the anchor point, but the ripples of that year spread out across centuries, touching every generation that followed. When we read the wills of indigenous women from the late 16th century, we see them trying to navigate a world that was hostile to their very existence, leaving their few possessions to daughters and granddaughters in an attempt to build a matrilineal line of defense against the poverty that surrounded them. These documents are filled with the inventory of survival: wool skirts, silver shawl pins, and small plots of land that meant the difference between starvation and survival. The cast paintings of the 18th century, with their rigid classifications of racial mixtures, are the artistic evidence of this anxiety, an attempt to impose order on a society that had been irrevocably mixed through violence and survival.
We must also consider the psychological impact of this history, the intergenerational trauma passed down through families, the silence that often surrounds the origins of mestizaje, and the shame that was projected onto indigenous women by the colonial church. Unpacking this requires a sensitivity to the emotional truth of the past, recognizing that behind every statistic and every bone fragment was a person who laughed and cried and loved and feared, just as we do. The story of the Andean woman in the colonial era is one of the most underreported chapters of human history, yet it is essential for understanding the formation of modern Latin America. It challenges the heroic narratives of the conquest and forces us to look at the cost of empire building. The cribra orbitalia in the skull of a young woman from a colonial cemetery is not just a medical term, it is an accusation, a physical proof of hunger and neglect that echoes through the centuries. The broken pottery in the abandoned Incan palace is not just trash, it is the frozen moment of a family's destruction. By piecing together these fragments, we can begin to reconstruct the whole picture, giving weight and volume to the shadows of the past. The work of historical recovery is slow and painstaking, requiring us to read against the grain of the archives to find the voices of those who were not meant to be heard. But when we do, we find a richness and a complexity that defies simple categorization. We find women who were victims, yes, but also women who were survivors, strategists, and guardians of their culture. We find a history that is dark and difficult, but also deeply human and undeniably relevant to our world today. The echoes of 1532 are still with us, and by listening to them, we honor the memory of those who lived through the collapse of their world and found a way to carry on. This is the true history of the conquest, the history that is written in the blood and the bones of the Andes, and it is a history that we must never forget. The Reed Partition forces us to look at the private spaces of history, the intimate violence that often goes unrecorded, but which shapes the destiny of nations. From the moment the first Spanish boot crossed the threshold of the indigenous home, the trajectory of the continent was changed forever. The loss of autonomy was the primary wound from which all other colonial injuries flowed. The loss of land, the loss of religion, the loss of freedom, all began with the loss of the self. But the story does not end there, because the human spirit is resilient, and the women of the Andes found ways to reclaim their agency, even in the darkest of times. They learned the laws of their oppressors and used them to fight back. They maintained their networks of kinship and reciprocity, and they kept the sacred fires burning in the mountains where the Spanish could not reach. This is their story, a story of survival against the odds, and it is a story that deserves to be told in all its complexity and depth. As we conclude this deep dive into the past, remember that history is not just what is written in books. It is what is buried in the ground and what is carried in the blood. The conquest was a singular event in time, but its legacy is a process that continues to unfold. By understanding the mechanisms of the past, the bioarchaeology, the legal loopholes, the economic incentives, we can better understand the present. The silence has been broken, and the testimony of the Reed Partition is finally being heard. 1532 was the beginning, but it was not the end. The indigenous women of the Andes survived, and in their survival, they defeated the ultimate goal of the conquest, which was their erasure. They are still here, and their story is the heartbeat of the Andes.